Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth CPDA session of PIMA-UAE Alumni, Introduction to Personal Resilience. First of all, I would like to apologize for the late start as we experience a little bit of a technical glitch, which is normal for events like this. So let's get on with this presentation today. Today's presentation, our speaker today, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Stephen Parkinson, Global Business Resilience Manager of DP World UAE. Stephen is the Group Business Resilience Manager at DP World, where he is responsible for delivering an operational resilience capability across DP World Group. Stephen's experience working in the field of resilience started during his time at the Commissioned Office in British Army. Over his decade of service, Stephen recognized the importance of identifying and improving a resilience capability, and in particular, investment in the resilience of individuals, teams, and the benefit that could bring to an organization when it was forced with difficulty. After leaving the military, Stephen worked in the Middle East for almost 2 years on a government-sponsored project to help improve crisis management, business continuity, and emergency response coordination across the Kuwaiti oil and gas sector. Stephen then went on to work for Barclays Bank, based in London, as their group crisis manager, where he was responsible for rebuilding the crisis management framework and overseeing its delivery across the organization. Using his military experience, Stephen rolled out a program of wargaming across the Barclays Group, winning the CIR magazine Transformation Strategy of the Year in 2016 for the innovative way the initiative was able to improve the resilience of teams. After moving in from Barclays, Stephen went on to become the group head of operational resilience for Sky, Europe's largest telecommunications and broadcasting group. Here, Stephen oversaw the delivery of a wide range of resilience disciplines, including crisis management, business continuity, emergency response, and physical security. In keeping with the culture of innovation at Sky, Stephen was able to try many new ways of delivering resilience across the group, leading to a recognition of the team worked through the CIR magazine's Business Continuity Award of Continuity Strategy of the Year in 2019 and the Initiative of the Year in 2020. Stephen started with DP World in May 2020 during the midst of COVID pandemic and has spent that time building a new operational resilience approach for the group. Stephen is a firm believer in the need to invest in our people if we want an organization to be truly resilient, and so as part of his operational resilience delivery. Stephen has initiated Project Bounce Back, which is focused on building the personal resilience of colleagues within DP World. Stephen is married and has 4 young children, all under the age of 4 years, and also 2 dogs and 2 cats. A handful, I'm sure, that will put his resilience skills into test on a daily basis. So he tells me that he welcomed this opportunity to come and share his experience with us. And this last session is brought to you by Hachi Salon. If you want to feel good and look good, please get in touch with them. So without further ado, I would welcome my colleague, Stephen, to take the stage and help us and take us to introduction to personal resilience. Steve, over to you.
Brilliant. And thank you all very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. I will start with an apology because it was my fault that we were slightly late. I'm not familiar with Zoom, so if there are any technical problems, it may be down to my my inexpertise with the system. But we in a true resilience fashion, we shall persevere. So thank you all very much for giving me this opportunity to speak to you all. this session on personal resilience is really a session of two parts. The first part is an introduction to the concept of personal resilience, and the second is an insight, a flavour into some of the tools that are available to us for us all to improve our own personal resilience. And I'm hoping that it's that second part that you will all find the most useful. Now, while the concept of personal resilience is broad and can often be complex, this introductory session is designed really to demonstrate just how we as individuals and as teams or as groups can be more resilient. Which is, given the current times, and we're still in the midst of a pandemic, is a really relevant topic, as I'm sure you'll agree. It'll be an interactive session, so hopefully that will work, and we'll put the powers of my newfound Zoom skills to the test. But I hope it will leave you with a better understanding of the topic, and most usefully with those tools I described earlier and some of the techniques that will be helpful to you now and in the future. And finally, before I begin, some of you may have a background or subject matter expertise in personal resilience, or indeed in some of the tools that we're going to discuss in this session. I've put this really together as something that could be used as an insight into this subject matter. So it's the lightest of touches into a subject which we would really need a lot more time and diligence than we can manage in the short time available to us today. So hopefully that's a worthwhile use of your time, is that light touch. So without further ado, let's look at what we're going to be discussing in this session. So the first part is I'll talk very briefly about aim and objectives of the session in sort of good sort of presentation fashion, but then we'll get into the meat of it and talk about what is personal resilience, why it's important, and I think it's important again that we also look at some of the science behind it as well. Then we'll open the toolkit and we'll get into the really useful parts, and I'd like to finish on 7 of my own tips for building personal resilience as well. So briefly then, and background, aim and objective. So this session is really here to set the conditions for us all to improve our own individual and community resilience. And I'll talk more about that community later. Why do we need to talk about this? Well, and why is it important for us to invest in ourselves and in others around us in this area? Because it's the right thing to do. Resilient people cope better with stress, with pressure. We have a happier community, that word again. We have better focus, better output, better morale as individuals. And most importantly, probably we're more adaptable to those times of disruption, just like we're experiencing now. Obviously, it's never been more relevant with COVID. We also have better productivity, better growth, better personal happiness. So the objectives of this session is really, it's to raise awareness of personal resilience and why it's important. We're also going to learn to use those tools I mentioned to enhance and manage our own personal resilience. And the aspiration for me, the big objective is that you'll come out of this session wanting to learn more and to go on to research some of the areas that we highlight today to improve your own personal resilience. So before we start, and this is where we really get interactive from the very, very start. You may have heard of a chap called Andrew Huberman. He's a psychologist who has done a lot of work around stress and stress management techniques. Andrew, amongst other things, is famous for coining a phrase around an old concept, which he calls the physiological sigh. And he claims in his studies that the physiological sigh is the fastest way to get relaxed, and he's deeply rooted that in scientific study. And if you do want to look at it afterwards, you'll see there's some really interesting areas that he sort of backs up this concept with. But you don't want to hear it from me, so here's the man himself.
So you'll notice I breathed in, and then I snuck in a little bit more air on a second inhale, and then I gave a long exhale.
So it's double inhale followed by an exhale. Typically the inhales are through the nose and the exhales through the mouth, although not always.
So there straight away is one of our tools. So every time we see this sign, this take a deep breath sign, what I'd like you all to do on this call is take that big double breath. So as Andrew said, it's take a big breath through the nose, almost as much as you can get into your lungs, and then a quick extra shot of oxygen on top of that, and then a slow exhale through your mouth. So every time I flash up this sign during the presentation, I'd like you to do that. And if Andrew's right, then some of you should feel that shot of relaxation each time you do it. So that's the first one of our tools we're going to practice during this session. So what is personal resilience? This session isn't to look at business or organizational issues, and organizational resilience is a faster growing concept as personal resilience, but it does help to just touch on that slightly. one of the definitions of organisation resilience is it's an ability to prevent, withstand, adapt to threats and shocks to our organisation. So when we talk about resilience of people, is that the same thing? Is it that ability to prevent, withstand and adapt to threats and shocks to ourselves? So that's the first thing I'll do is I'll throw that open to the floor, and I'll ask all of you, what are some of the things that you think about when you think about personal resilience? So before we even get into this presentation, that concept, that phrase, personal resilience, what are some of the things that you think about when you hear that phrase? Maybe one or two word answers. If you could put them in the chat now, it'd be really good to hear what your view is.
You can, everyone, you can use the chat at the bottom of the screen and select everyone or the panel. Yes, thank you.
That's great. Adapt to change and bounce back, brilliant. How you face challenges, sustaining pressure, excellent. Ability to withstand the challenges. Yeah, brilliant. Great, thank you. So I'll that's some really, really good answers there. And it's, you know, some of the ones I thought of before this session, that, you know, that ability to bounce back has been mentioned there in the chat. You know, it's also about turning challenges into opportunities, you know, transforming the negative into a positive. You know, it's an ability to roll with the punches, and an ability to reduce physical and mental cost or the impact of disruption and sort of weather a storm, as someone quite rightly put there, you know, sustaining pressure. Really, personal resilience is all about keeping going through difficult times. It's a coping mechanism, but it's also much more than that. It's an ability to use pressure to help optimize your own personal performance. It's a positive response to change. It also encompasses emotional flexibility and psychological flexibility, and at its best, it can develop a sense of team or a sense of community. That word again. And we've seen some good answers along a common theme there, but whatever our individual thoughts are on personal resilience, it's clear that we all have an intuitive understanding of what it means, but that can be tuned slightly differently for each of us. You know, some of us, it could be about coping, some of us, it be about taking opportunities, you know, the positive versus the negative. But while the use of the word resilience in the personal context might have only been around for a few decades, this concept of personal resilience, that intuitive feeling of what it means is not a new concept and has been around for centuries. So, you know, a few quotes here, you'll have heard this: survival of the fittest. It's often coined as, but it's not the strongest of the species that survives. It's not the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that's most adaptable to change. You could say it's the one that's the most resilient. Again, you know, this idea of sustaining pressure, Winston Churchill, and you know, really, really tough times for the world. Nietzsche, who coined this famous phrase, "What does not kill me makes me stronger," in his book Twilight of the Idols. Nelson Mandela, you know, a really good example of an individual who's probably gone through some of the most personal, difficult, testing times, you know, that rising every time you fall. And then one of my personal favorites is Robert Jordan's an author, and he included this in one of his books, but it's actually an adapted phrase from Aesop's Fables, for those who are familiar with it. But it's the oak fought the wind and was broken, the willow bent when it must and survived. I find that a really beautiful sort of illustrative example of what personal resilience means. These are all different examples of expressing the same thing, and that's the thing about personal resilience. It's a very personal experience. It means different things to different people, and we'll see there are some really good scientific reasons for that. If you take a cursory search of the internet now, you'll find dozens, if not hundreds, of definitions. But essentially, however we describe it, it's all about being able to manage difficult periods and stay or come back stronger. My favorite way to describe it is sort of bounce back ability, and that's why we've launched Project Bounce Back in my organization at the moment, a program on personal resilience for DP World. But after this session, if you have the time, it's worth the exercise to take a moment and decide what personal resilience means to you. And I would really suggest that, you know, you take that away as a sort of first step on a personal resilience journey for those who are, you know, willing to take this on afterwards, and just describe for yourself what you think personal resilience means, and that will sort of give you an insight into what it means for you. And then start you on that sort of mental journey of looking at why that is important and why you picked that particular phrase. So we'll do a quick exercise, and again, in the spirit of keeping it interactive, Thinking about our own perceptions of what we think personal resilience is, I'd like you to ask yourself, who is more resilient? The Incredible Hulk, leap tall buildings, battle tanks, etc., or the lovable Shrek, lives in a swamp partying with a donkey? Who is more resilient? And I hope you've both seen both these movies, or you're aware of who these characters are. But again, could I ask you to put your answers in the chat there? Who, the incredibly strong Incredible Hulk or Shrek, who do you think is more personally resilient? Oh, and why? Just a little line on why. Lots going for Shrek at the moment. Yeah, I think everyone's going for Shrek. Why do you think that is? He never loses hope, keeps at it. I like it. He seems cool no matter what. Yeah, great. Some really good answers. The Incredible Hulk, very physically strong, but often he's unhappy with himself. He has trouble containing his emotions. Hulk smash. He's an individual. He finds it very difficult to work with others, to build that sense of community. Shrek, strong social network. Hangs around with the gingerbread man, happy with life, weathers adversity. As we've some really good answers here. He's happy-go-lucky. It's a bit of a loaded question, because whether we think the Hulk is more resilient or Shrek, it's a very personal opinion, and based on what we feel resilience means to us. But going through this exercise gives us a chance. It's a bit, we've used some really sort of comic book examples here, but if you do go through this exercise, it does give you a chance to self-reflect and think about what are those resilience traits we want to develop in ourselves. And again, another exercise I'd really encourage you to do after this is, once you've asked that question about what personal resilience is to take a moment and just take some time to think about someone you perceive as being resilient, and write down just 3 traits that you think make that individual resilient, and that will start to give you a good idea. It will start to shape what areas you might want to develop in yourself from a personal resilience point of view. Okay, so now take that big double breath. And if you, like me, if it works, it might not work for everyone, but if you, like me, you should get that little sort of shot of oxygen and start to feel a little sense of some of these tools that can work to help improve your management of stress. So why is personal resilience important? And before we get into some of the science of it, it's because it's all about us. It's all about people. It's all about our families. It's all about our community. Building resilience on an individual basis makes it easier to build resilience within our community. And I keep coming back to that word, because it describes those social bonds we experience every day. So whether I do apologize. Whether it's a team, a social group, like you guys all on this call today, whether it's our family, whether it's work, building resilient communities helps us to help each other, and it allows us to be the best we can be. So whatever the walk of life it is, whatever it is that we're trying to deliver, if we're resilient as a community, it will help us to do that in the best way possible. So let's discuss why we even need to talk about resilience at all. And we'll talk about this, anxiety or stress, and some of the phrases that you'll be familiar with as a link to the concept of personal resilience. So stress is the feeling of being under too much mental or emotional pressure. And pressure turns into stress when you feel like you're unable to cope. And I'll touch on that when we go through some of the science of resilience shortly. People have different ways of reacting to stress. So a situation that feels stressful to one person may actually be motivating to someone else. Many of life's demands can cause stress, and we'll look at some practical examples of that shortly. But it could be things like, work, relationships, money. I'm sure you've got some things on your mind at the moment that are causing you stress. And when you feel stressed, it can get in the way of your ability to sort out these demands, or it can even affect other areas of your life and other things that you're trying to achieve. So in the short term, stress can affect how you feel, think, behave, and how your body works. Some of the short-term common signs of stress you'll be well aware of, but sleeping problems, sweating, loss of appetite, difficulty concentrating. You may feel anxious, irritable. It may start to affect your emotions. You may get just a low self-esteem, and you may have racing thoughts. You may worry constantly or go over things in your head. It may affect your behavior with others. So you may find that you're losing your temper more easily, and you may start to develop bad habits to manage the stress. So you may use things like alcohol or medication, cigarettes, etc. Or you may use other mechanisms which are unreasonable behaviour. You may also experience sort of headaches, muscle tension, pain, or dizziness at the sort of extreme end of short-term stress. In the long term, while a little stress, every now and then is not something to be concerned about, ongoing chronic stress can cause or exacerbate many serious health problems. And these include mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, personality disorders. It can cause or exacerbate obesity and other eating disorders. It can cause skin and hair problems, so acne, psoriasis, eczema. It can even lead to hair loss. And at its worst, it can lead to high blood pressure, abnormal heart rhythms, heart attacks, and at its very worst, stroke. But don't panic. One of the first steps on the journey to becoming more resilient is about recognizing these harmful effects of stress and being able to move ourselves to a position where we can identify what's causing that stress in our lives and be in a position to be able to manage it. So on that sort of relatively negative note, now let's take a big double breath. And for some of you, I hope this is starting to sort of help you feel.
I think somebody's microphone was on. Steve, we can continue.
There we go. Sorry. Yeah, got you. Okay, great. Okay, so let's go on to some of the science then. So when we talk about stress and when we talk about resilience, this phrase fight or flight will often come up, but homeostasis you may or may not have heard about. So I'll talk about both very briefly now, and you'll see why it's really important to know about these concepts for any discussion on personal resilience. So fight or flight, which is it's known as an acute stress response. That term fight or flight was first used by this chap Walter B. Cannon in 1915, and he studied it and taught at Harvard University in the Department of Psychology, and he specialised in particular in the research of physical reactions of lab animals under pressure. And in this research, Cannon observed noticeable physical changes in the digestive systems of animals experiencing fear, so an emotional, physiological change which is causing physical issues in the animals. And he subsequently spent 20 years studying the relationship of psychological and physical effects of stress on animals and turned that into a beneficial research for humans. So Cannon redefined the biological term homeostasis, and basically what he was talking about is the internal balance of the body. And according to Cannon, basically, he thought that our bodies are constantly trying to seek or maintain a predefined state of equilibrium. So basically trying to regulate all the time to get to this healthy balance. And things like changes in variables like body temperature, fluid balance, etc. They all set up processes all aimed at returning the body back to this original balance based on environmental issues or triggers. There's also a newer concept which I won't go into in this presentation called allostasis, just in case people have heard about it, which is a bit more complex and talks about maintaining stability through change, but broadly the physiological concepts are the same. So what Cannon identified was that when our fight or flight response kicked in, once the threat was gone, our body would naturally try and revert back to this state of homeostasis. So we would have an emotional trigger, it would create a physical change, and then the body would try and bring us back to this healthy balance. So what is this fight or flight reaction? So when you encounter a perceived threat, and it might be you're on your morning walk and you hear a large dog barking, basically your hypothalamus, which is a tiny region at the base of your brain, it sets off an alarm system in your body, and it's wired to cut through your day-to-day thoughts, because obviously as you know, when we were all primitive people, the faster we could get to the state of fight or flight, the more likely we were to be able to protect ourselves. So through a combination of nerve and hormonal signals, this system basically, it prompts your adrenal glands, which are on top of your kidneys, to release a surge of hormones. And this includes some of the stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. So adrenaline increases your heart rate and elevates your blood pressure. It also boosts energy supplies, so it can help you run away from a threat, or be able to do the fighting if necessary. Cortisol, which is the primary stress hormone, that increases sugars, glucose in the bloodstream, and it enhances your brain's use of glucose and increases the availability of substances that repair tissues. And that use of glucose allows you to think more clearly, allows you to maintain the stress response for a long time, allows you to focus on the task ahead, all geared around being able to survive. So let's look at a quick video which will just illustrate some of the things I've just been talking about there that Canon mentioned.
Humans, like all species, have self-protective mechanisms to help us survive. Our fight, flight, or freeze survival response, the FFF for short, is designed to mobilize our brain and body to fight an enemy, run from an avalanche, or freeze to hide from a predator. Our brain sometimes misinterprets safe situations as dangerous and can set off false alarms. When the amygdala, our brain's watchdog, senses and barks danger, our body enters survival mode quicker than our rational mind can react, leaving it trying to figure out why we feel in mortal danger. When the FFF alarm is sounded, we start to breathe more quickly and shallow, causing hyperventilation, and our heart starts beating very fast. These changes can cause strong chest pain, which many people interpret as symptoms of a heart attack, when in fact it's just a result of the FFF activation, which can be relieved through breathing exercises. As a way of getting you ready for action, blood is diverted towards the major muscle groups. Blood flows away from our digestive system, causing the bladder to relax, and we might feel the need to pee. The mouth goes dry, nausea can occur, and we get the butterflies feeling in our stomach. Blood also rushes from extremities, leaving us with cold hands, but often sweaty palms as the action-ready body starts sweating to avoid overheating. Legs and hands can start trembling and feel weak, while tension starts building in big muscles like the thighs, neck, and shoulders. In our head, FFF alarms cause our brain to focus on negative memories, probably so it can scan them to avoid danger and negative outcomes. We get tunnel vision as our pupils dilate to increase our focus and long vision, but as a result, we lose our peripheral vision. FFF activation also reduces our ability to recognize differences in facial expressions. Too much oxygen and too little CO2 can result in dizziness or lightheadedness, which many people interpret as signs that they might faint. But because fainting is caused by a drastic drop in blood pressure, and because the FFF increases both our heart rate and blood pressure, it's nearly impossible to faint when this happens. Over time, depression, anxiety, and high levels of stress all harm the brain's ability to slow or cancel false FFF activations, causing them to happen more often. Knowing the symptoms of false activations makes it easier to recognize and reduce their effects.
Okay, so just so again, you were starting to learn about some of the physical signs of that emotional or psychological trigger. So when we talk about triggers, in fact, we'll get into triggers, but let's just look very briefly at a little bit more on what's happening inside the body, and then we'll start building on that and looking at how we can move away from some of these external triggers triggering this automatic primitive response and into some of the ways that we can manage it. So we know that homeostasis is when the body tries to find that natural balance, sometimes following something like the fight or flight response we've just looked at. And it's something called the autonomic nervous system that is trying to find that balance. And it's balancing off between the two things you can see here on the diagram, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic halves of that nervous system. It's always trying to find that harmony, that homeostasis. And it's trying to do that regardless of the outside influences. So a really good example of the body doing that is that, as I mentioned before, the regulation of temperature. So regardless of the weather, whether it's hot or cold, the human body will always strive to maintain that internal temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius, which we're a lot more familiar with in these times of COVID. But that's a really good example of that homeostasis that the body's trying to achieve. So these two halves then, the parasympathetic nervous system, that's responsible for preparing the body's reactions at rest and maintaining homeostasis. So when we've just had a big meal, it's the parasympathetic nervous system that kicks in, which is often why we feel tired and relaxed. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for preparing the body's reactions to stress or injury or perceived threats. And that's that fight or flight part. And you can see some of the physical aspects to that fight or flight response there. And obviously we heard some in the video. So when we look at triggers then, the things that might trigger this response, we come into an issue because in the old days, it might have been a large animal, or it might have been, other humans threatening us. But in the 21st century, there are a lot of triggers that might actually set off this sympathetic nervous system or fight or flight response. It could be things like that big pile of work you don't think you'll be able to achieve. It could be the big pitch meeting that we have to make to the executives, or it could be, the angry boss who wants that word with you. In our hyperlinked and fast-paced society, these triggers can come in thick and fast and one on top of the other, and for a sustained period of time, which can put that sympathetic nervous system reaction into gear for longer periods. So our reaction to a potentially stressful event is unique, and although we all have these same physical responses, the extent and the way these responses manifest themselves in each of us as an individual can be very, very different. And how we react to those life stresses is affected by a few factors. So the first is genetics. So the genes that control the stress response that keep most people on a fairly steady emotional level, whereas only occasionally it will sort of prime the body to go into that fight or flight response. But overreactive or underreactive stress responses in people, there's people who panic quite often or get feel stressed all the time. It may be that they have slight differences in some of their genes. But also, and probably the biggest differentiator in how we perceive stress or how those triggers manifest themselves is life experiences. Strong stress reactions can sometimes be traced to traumatic events. People who are neglected or abused as children tend to be particularly vulnerable to stress. And the same is true of people who've experienced violent crime, crash survivors, military people, police officers, etc. They can all, because of their experience, they can all move into that fight or flight response a lot faster, and it can be in place for a much more sustained period. You may have some friends who seem relaxed. On the conversely, you may have some friends who are always relaxed. Almost everything and that would normally stress you just doesn't seem to stress them, and it may be because they've just had different experiences to you. So this is all important to know, because knowing why we get a threat response, knowing why that sympathetic nervous system kicks in and we go that fight or flight response it's important, because it sort of leads us to identify what causes those stress responses and why. And knowing this can lead to the next stage of being able to do something positive to manage them, or turn them from a threat into something that we can actually deal with. So let's look at that very briefly now. So we've seen the signs of a stress reaction, but it's just as important to know the signs of when we're coming out of a stress reaction, because that'll help us in future to set the conditions or speed up that move from stress response back to homeostasis, to Cannon's balance, from fight or flight to rest and digest. So the body's stress response system is usually self-limiting. So once a perceived threat is passed and the brain no longer perceives, that the environment is dangerous, that the frontal cortex will get a message of alarm cancelled, and the hormone levels will start returning to normal. And as that adrenaline and cortisol I mentioned before, as they drop, the heart rate and blood pressure will return to those baseline levels, and all the other systems will resume their regular activities. Now, the time it takes to do that is it's usually about 20 minutes to start the recovery, to move that alarm state in. But then to get those hormones out of your body can take up to an hour or more from the first stress response. So adrenaline, which is the first thing to kick in, and then it's cortisol. The adrenaline can take up to 20 minutes to clear, but the cortisol can take a lot longer. So you may find one trigger leaves us actually experiencing the symptoms of stress for up to an hour afterwards. So when we start looking at those multiple triggers overlaid on top of each other and happening at a fast pace, we start to see that the stress reaction can last for much longer, and it can inhibit our ability to move back to homeostasis, to find that balance. So when we look at things like, day-to-day things like multitasking, bills that come in, conflict with colleagues, lost phones, broken appliance, car breakdowns. Now, all these sorts of things were non-existent in the early days of human species. But the problem for us now is that we're faced with them all the time, and we can't turn off that surge of adrenaline when our attack is a phone bill. And when we feel like those stresses are always present and you constantly feel under attack, that fight or flight reaction can stay turned on. Now, the good news is our bodies can uphold the stress reaction for a very long time, and we're built to face threats and fight for our lives, normally in rapidly escalated situations, but ones that could be over quite quickly, but then move into a new stressor. So activation and preparedness to attack are normal reactions for us. But those stress responses can vary, and they're happening all the time and throughout the day, every single day. And in some circumstances, they can actually lead to alterations in our performance. Now, some stress is actually good. Some stress can actually be beneficial to our daily lives. I'll show you that now.
Stress is usually seen as something we need to avoid. This is not true. We need stress, and we need our body's stress hormone cortisol to rise and fall throughout the day. Stress helps us to wake up in the morning. It helps us to focus, to learn, and to remember things throughout the day. But at night, cortisol drops so we can sleep. Stress can include training, work, school, relationships, finances, moving, changing jobs, or loss of a loved one. Both positive and negative experiences will affect your stress level. It's when people experience too much stress and difficulty coping that stress becomes a problem.
So having a stress reaction sounds bad, but actually it can be a good thing, and healthy doses are a part of what's good for getting us through a normal day. Okay, so before we move on, just can we take that big double breath, and for some of you, I really hope this is working to help you stay relaxed. So we've spoken about our fight or flight response, and now we should start looking at the resilience aspects of it as well. We know that the fight or flight response is triggered by a perceived threat, and we also now know that the physiological reaction can manifest itself in different ways. So what next? Most people, we don't have these multiple breakdowns, or we don't feel unable to cope throughout the day. But our fight or flight response, we've seen, kicks in throughout the day through all these different day-to-day pressures that we're seeing. So why is that? Well, this is where it helps to start thinking about pressure versus stress. And we often use those two terms interchangeably, but I'd argue that it helps to start thinking about them slightly differently. So pressure is where it's a situation where you perceive that something's at stake and it's dependent on the outcome of your performance, but you feel like you've got the ability or the resources to manage this situation well. And in fact, in many cases, you may actually welcome that fight or flight response because it's helping you. Remember from the video, it helps you keep focused, or it's helping to keep your energy levels high. So again, some examples could be, that elevator pitch with the chairman. It could be the pitch meeting, for your big idea. It could be a big charity race you're about to compete in. So even though there is a high level of performance and a positive outcome that's absolutely needed, if you feel well prepared or well resourced to manage these situations, then for most of us, even though our fight or flight response kicks in, it'll be manageable. So having that fight or flight response when we're under these circumstances can actually help us get through periods of pressure. And again, remember from the video, it can help us to stay hyper-focused on the task at hand. And it can also alert us to any sudden changes in the situation, say, Zoom failing partway through a presentation like this. It can still be linked to feelings of anxiety and fear. So you can still feel like you're sort of walking a tightrope, or it's do or die. But it's one where you feel that you've got enough resources to be able to manage it, that the situation is manageable. So then we get onto stress. So stress is where that pressure becomes too much and you feel overwhelmed. And if you think about it, it usually happens when you're in a situation that feels like there are too many demands and not enough resources. So there's not enough time, not enough money, not enough knowledge to meet the demand that's come in, the trigger. So examples could be, a long list of tasks to do and being unsure where to start. It could be you've been asked a question and you don't think you've got the experience to answer it properly. The resource loss is lack of experience. It could be a meeting that runs over time when you've got another deadline. It could be with that big bill that lands and you're uncertain on how to pay. And it can be linked because of this lack of resources. It can manifest itself as a feeling of overload or uncertainty, a feeling of panic, or a need to run away or hide. But whether a situation feels like pressure or stress to you is really subjective, and it depends on whether you feel that in that given situation, you have the resources to adequately manage it. So I'm going to give you a personal story very briefly. And this is me back in the day when I was in the army, enjoying a rare break from a patrol to eat a nice lolly. So there's one time where I had to do a patrol, and I had to insert at night time into a city, and I had to cross a bridge to get there with a small team. And being a good officer, I was sort of leading from the front, leading the patrol, and I'd periodically turn around to check that the guys were okay behind me. One of these moments, I turned around, turned back to face forward, and then fell through a hole in the ground. So I hadn't seen this hole in the bridge, and the amount of I had about 30 or 40 kilos worth of extra equipment that I was carrying, you know, helmet, etc. And if I'd have gone through, you know, if I'd have gone all the way through the hole into the river, there was absolutely no way I would have survived. It was a real life or death situation. However, I managed to catch myself on the corner of the hole. It was actually my rifle caught on the hole, so I was sort of dangling 20 meters or so above this river. Now, that was a real life or death situation, but I didn't feel overwhelmed. I didn't panic. I didn't feel like, I wasn't able to cope, because I knew I wasn't going anywhere. I was caught, and I knew, most importantly, I knew I had the team really close to me, and they were able to help me. I had all the resources to be able to cope and manage. If we move on about a year, so I was on a course again in the military, and for one particular aspect of this course, we had to jump off a high dive. We had 2 minutes to climb to the top of the high dive, about 20 meters up, in some clothes, jump off the high dive, and then swim to the side of a swimming pool. So it was a really simple task. I was a strong swimmer. I knew I'd be able to do it. And we were all in a sort of conveyor belt of people climbing the high dive, jumping off, swimming to the edge of the pool. So I got to the top, and the chap in front of me jumped off. And I walked to the edge, ready to do my part, and I was being timed this whole time. And the guy in front of me had some real difficulties. He was really struggling for whatever reason, and he had to be assisted to get out of the pool. Now, all the time this was happening, even though I knew I could do this task, even though I knew it was well within my ability to manage it, my time, one of my resources, was being taken away, and I started to feel overwhelmed. I started to feel panicked. I started to feel like I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm not going to be able to swim. I'm going to be like this guy in front of me. I'm going to need assistance, and I'm going to fail this course. So 2 very different situations, or similar in sort of nature, for falling off large heights in the military. But a real good example of where, if you've got the resources, that trigger, that stress trigger can actually feel like pressure, or it can feel like stress, depending on whether you've got the resources and the ability to be able to manage it. So pressure in the example on the patrol, stress for me on the example of jumping off the high dive. So I was going to ask us to do a quick exercise, but in the interest of time, just because I did lose us a bit of time at the start of this exercise, I'll just move us on. But I was going to ask you all for an example of stress and pressure in your life. But if you could perhaps just have a think about those moments when you felt that fight or flight response kick in, and just think to yourself, did you feel like you were overwhelmed? Or did you feel like you were able to manage that? Because if you felt like you were overwhelmed, it's probably because you were experiencing stress at that moment rather than pressure. And ask yourself why. What was the resource that you felt that you didn't have, or you didn't have enough of, that created that feeling of being overwhelmed? So I won't ask you now. I'll just we'll move on for this, just in the interest of time. So that's a lot of information there, but that's the science bit over. So let's all take that big double breath. Okay, and let's open the toolkit on personal resilience, and I hope this is the most useful part of this session. So now we know what stress and pressure are and what can cause it for us, and we know it's all that individual experiences we've seen. That allows us to spot our triggers and to train ourselves to react in a different way. It also allows us to stop the triggers in a good sort of risk management way, whether that's through coping strategies like avoiding the stress, accepting the stress, sharing the stress, using something else to be able to manage it. Or for those occasions when the stress reaction's already kicked in, then being in a position to manage those symptoms so we know we're in the fight or flight response and being able to manage it. So knowing what we know now puts us in a position to start thinking about solutions, and it really starts with developing some helpful ways to think of our stress and think of our way around the problem.
When trying to measure our stress tolerance, the bucket analogy can be helpful. Our stress tolerance, or the size of our bucket, is a product of our genes, personality, and life experiences, and its size varies from person to person. The water in this analogy is the combination of all the stress in your life. We use the coping strategies we have available to keep our bucket from overflowing. They are like taps that allow water to drain from the bucket. Stress can include training, work, school, relationships, finances, moving, changing jobs, or the loss of a loved one. Both positive and negative experiences will affect the water level. A big bucket can hold more water or stress before it overflows. With a smaller bucket, less water is required for the water or stress level to become critical. While you can't change the size of your bucket, you can make life adjustments to reduce water coming in. You can also learn new coping strategies and stress management techniques to allow water to drain out. Mind tools, exercise, quality sleep, relaxation, and sharing your feelings with friends are some examples of effective water taps. Staying up late, sleeping in, drugs, inactivity, procrastination, suppressing or ignoring problems are examples of unhelpful coping strategies or false taps. They might give temporary relief, but actually result in water flowing back into your bucket.
Okay, so thinking differently on a personal level about our own stresses and where they're putting us in the zone of pressure or stress is the first tool we can use. But there are other tools as well, and there's lots and lots of tools, and I'm just going to touch on some of them very briefly in the last 5 minutes of this session. I've tried to map these into a really simple framework just for us to discuss, but it's one for you to think about after this when you're doing your own research into personal resilience. So the first part is mind, then body, then action. So mind, thinking our way around the stresses or stress response, and we've seen some examples of that already in that video. Body, taking physical steps to manage the stress reactions, and then action, changing our stress environment to be able to reduce the impact of some of the perceived threats. So remember, this presentation is just a taster in some of these areas. When you look into it in more detail, you see there's so much more that we can discuss. Things like financial resilience, emotional resilience, psychological resilience, etc. But under these very simple 3 categories, there's some really good examples of tools which we can look at and take away in this session. So in mind, there's things like cognitive behavioral therapy and things like mindfulness, which hopefully you will have heard of, or if not, we'll very briefly touch on shortly. Things like positive affirmation can make a real difference to us being able to manage and deal with our stresses. Body, so really simple things. There's really close causal links between a healthy diet and exercise, things like getting enough sleep and our ability to deal with or manage stress. And then other things like meditation, breathing techniques like we've used throughout this session, and physical relaxation can all help. And then finally, taking action. So when we know we're in that stress environment, doing really simple things to reduce the noise, things like prioritization of work tasks. If you've got so much work you don't know what to do, just being able to simply prioritize it so that you're in a position to be able to manage and cope. So on the mind side, just very brief tools before I go into my 7 tips. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a really interesting area that's been scientifically proven to be able to actually physically rewire the brain. But very simple techniques like mindfulness can actually help our ability to deal with stress. It just helps us with thinking of stress in a different way and the mind in a different way.
Imagine you're walking down a street. It's a street you know well, maybe one you walk down every single day. But you're so caught up in your own thinking, wondering what you're going to have for lunch, thinking back to a conversation you had earlier, that you end up falling down a hole. Now at the bottom of this hole, you find yourself thinking, how did I end up here? Worse yet, the next day, you do the exact same thing. And then again, the next day. It may not sound like an especially cheerful idea, but as an analogy for the mind, it's really helpful, because so often we follow the same habits of mind over and over again. And so we find ourselves in an emotional hole, maybe even a place that's really painful. But imagine if you started just noticing, being more aware of your surroundings. Sure, maybe next time you'd realize a little too late and you'd still end up in the hole again. But maybe the time after that, you'd notice the hole and choose to walk around it instead. This is what it means to train the mind.
And I did have another video, but in the interest of time, I'll just move on. But there's lots of different things we can do to think differently about the problems, and that's the point. It helps us be able to manage those stress triggers in a different way by thinking differently about the way they affect us. There's things we can do with the body, as I mentioned, and one of these is box breathing. This is a Navy SEALs technique. It's borrowed from well-known practices over centuries, things like Buddhist meditation or yoga. I was going to give it a go, but we lost that 5 minutes, so I just want to get to the 7 tips. But I will show you the technique, and I'd really encourage you to practice this at home if you've not used this before. And the idea is that you inhale for 4 seconds, hold it for 4 seconds, exhale for 4 seconds, and then hold it again for 4 seconds with those empty lungs. And when you breathe in, you breathe in through the tongue by pushing out your tummy. You should know you're doing it right, because it will press on your belt and you feel your tummy push out. So by doing that for 4 minutes, it can induce a state of extreme relaxation, and it's something that is becoming increasingly popular in high stress environments like the Navy SEALs do. I was going to take you through an exercise, but I'd encourage you to all practice that if you feel comfortable doing the session in your own time. And then finally, practical things we can do to take action is things like just prioritization of work tasks, and just do simple things to be able to declutter our working environment.
If you always plan on doing too much, use the 1-3-5 list to limit yourself to a more realistic amount. If you work best at certain times, organize your tasks by how much energy they take, so you know what to do when. If you want to cut some things off your list, group them by urgency and importance to figure out what matters most right now. If your days always seem like they're getting away from you, give each task a block of time on your schedule. If you're always juggling a lot of things, give each day a theme so you can focus on similar to-dos.
Very simple things, but again, it's very simple ways of reducing that stress or the stress triggers. So last 30 seconds from me. All of the things we've covered in this session, we can distill into 7 tips. And I've actually adapted these from the American Psychological Association. The first step is to understand your stress, as we've spoken about. It can be different for everyone, but by understanding what our stress looks like for us, we can be better prepared and we can reach into that stress management toolbox when needed. The second tip is to identify your stress sources. So what are those triggers? What causes you to be stressed, whether it's in work, family, whether it's change in your life, or whether it's the potential 1,000 other triggers that we spoke about in the 21st century. Third one is to recognize stress signals. So what is happening to us when this stress trigger manifests itself? What is our internal alarm bells? Is it low tolerance, feeling of panic, the stomach pains, a combination of other symptoms? Then it's about recognizing what our existing stress strategies are. What's our go-to tactic for calming down? These could be learned behaviors over years, and sometimes they're not always healthy options. So it could be stress eating or using suppressants or things like cigarettes, etc. Then it's about making change. So it's about implementing healthy stress management strategies, and it's good to be mindful of any current unhealthy ones so we can switch them out for healthy ones. And for example, if overeating's your current go-to, we could try practice a breathing exercise instead, or phone a friend. And I'd strongly suggest that you try swapping out each of these bad ones for a healthy one at a time. It's the most effective way of creating that positive change. Making self-care a priority when we take time for ourselves is really important, and it can often feel selfish, but it's like that airplane analogy. Put our own oxygen mask on before we can assist others. It's these simple things that can promote well-being. So things like getting enough sleep, food, getting downtime for ourselves, and exercising. They're often the ones that are most overlooked. But self-care will for you will help your community, your family, your colleagues, etc. Make us all resilient. And then the last tip from me before I close this session is to ask for support when needed. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, reach out to a friend or family member you can talk to, speak with a healthcare professional who can help reduce stress and help us learn those healthier coping strategies. I'm sorry, I meant to leave a little bit more time for questions, but obviously I took away a little bit at the start, just getting set up. But I'll hand over to Anjana now and the team. But I hope you enjoyed that session. I hope you found it productive and worthwhile. And I've certainly enjoyed the opportunity to talk to you about it.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that wonderful presentation. Especially, I think this is a topic that is more relevant and timely. As I was going through the content that you were presenting, just realized, like, sometimes we do not personally feel that we are sort of receiving, in breaking point. It's always good to know those stress points, sometimes which does not come to our mind directly. So thank you so much for taking us through this session. With the interest of time, there are 2 quick questions, if you don't mind. I thought I'll take through it. Yes, the first question is, one of the participants would like to know that the link between the emotional intelligence and the personal resilience. How do you sort of link it up?
Yeah, again, this is a really good indication of knowing yourself, and by knowing yourself, being in a position to build in some of those improvements yourself. So by having a really detailed understanding of who you are emotionally, what your coping strategies are, your ability to implement positive emotional changes, etc., are all part of that's a really good, healthy self-analysis, which can help you build in personal resilience as well. There's some really interesting stuff in the field about emotional resilience, which is I could talk for another hour on that as well.
Yeah, maybe that gives us the opportunity to look at another potential session with you to look into that. And then one more I would take up is this is going to be a continuous journey, because in life, I guess everyone experienced this. So in terms of continuation, what is your sort of advice? Okay, we identify the triggers and then we know the symptoms. So how does that sort of one should continue in sort of improving the resilience?
Yeah, so one thing that is really important to bear in mind with some of these is when you've identified your triggers, your current coping strategies, and then identified those strategies that you want, those healthy strategies that you wanted to take on for yourself. It's important to recognize that they're not going to work for you, not all going to work for you as an individual. So the box breathing technique, for example, some people may feel uncomfortable. It may not make them feel relaxed, but some people might find it incredibly useful. And I think my advice would be to practice, you feel free to use that framework, mind, body, and action, but to practice those different tools and find those ones which actually help you manage stress in the most effective way. And it's probably going to be a combination of quite a few different tools and strategies, and then to use them and build on them. And as you research, to develop things that actually work for you. So that would be my advice, is to go out and look at the strategies that work for you, and then sort of build on those and develop them.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Steve. I know there are a few other comments coming in. Just a note for the participants, we will be taking a thing up with Steve and then get back to you on the answers. Next, I would like to invite our president, Mr. Damit Fonseca, to address the participants.
Hi, everyone. We have now come to an end of another successful virtual CPD program. On behalf of PIMA-UAE, it is my pleasure to extend our sincere appreciation to all of you. Before I mention the individual names who are behind this event today, I would like to give a brief background about us. PIMA-UAE is the Alumni Association of Postgraduate Institute of Management, commonly known as PIM, which is functioning under University of Sri Jawadharpura, Sri Lanka. PIMA-UAE was established in 2012, and since then we have been doing many knowledge sharing programs like this, and also various social responsibility activities in the UAE as well as in Sri Lanka, and many other entertainment events. In addition to these activities, PIMA-UAE has been very instrumental in supporting our university to produce new MBA graduates in the UAE, as well as the Gulf region. The next MBA intake is going to be in October in this year, and I kindly request everyone to spread this message also. So PIMA-UAE presently having more than 150 members who had graduated from the UAE, and we operate under the flagship of legal body called Sri Lankan Professional Association in the UAE. PIMA-UAE has formed 6 subcommittees to manage our activities, and all the subcommittees have planned more than 35 activities throughout the year in line with the present health guidelines and regulations. So our major activities in the next quarter are going to be a virtual New Year celebration, which is, I'm sure, which is going to be a new experience for everyone. And we have already shared a detailed flyer, and I request everyone to register for the games and the activities from now onwards. And a few CPD programs already planned, and journal release is going to be done soon, and setting up of entrepreneurial development projects are in our pipeline. More details will be shared through our social media platforms time to time. That is through our LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. As a special note, I would like to remind everyone about our e-journal publication, which is going to be planned to release in June 2021. So I request everyone to submit your articles before 30th of April. And general guidelines are already uploaded in our website, and you may see the link in the flyer also. Or if you need any clarification, you can email to our journals publishing and academics affairs subcommittee through journal@PIMA-UAE, or contact Samanthi or Ajanta for further guidelines. I request someone in the journal committee to share these details in the chat box also, so we can get more details precisely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to take much of your time now. First of all, I would like to thank our speaker today, Mr. Stephen Parkinson, for having this wonderful CPD program on personal resilience. And Mr. Stephen, we appreciate your presence today and delivering this informative and relatable topic with us. I'm sure this will be very useful for everyone. Secondly, also I would like to thank people who joined with us today. Thank you everyone for attending this session, and hope you have gained valuable knowledge. And without you, we cannot have this successful event. Also, our event sponsors today, Salon Hachi, we thank you for your support. And we have arranged, actually they have arranged special vouchers for everyone. So if someone wants to avail the special service at discounted prices, you can ask for these vouchers. And also note that we are going to have e-certificates for all the participants today. So all your certificates will be emailed by our CPD committee. In case if you need any clarification or name changes, anything, you can email to cpd@pima-ua.com. So I'm sure that everyone will be agreed that CPD event need proper planning and coordination. So last but not least, the CPD committee headed by Sudashi and Anjana, and our executive committee and the past presidents, I would like to extend my gratitude for everyone. So we'd like to see you soon with the next event, hopefully in April, and have a good night and stay safe. Thank you.